Your audio is probably working, but we are muted so you don't hear background noise. So please don't panic. Your audio is probably working if you can hear my voice.
Yeah, thanks, John. And actually, we'll get started now. So hopefully that audio will continue to work for everyone. So hello, everyone, and welcome to a Corwin Monday afternoon webinar. We hope you're off to a great start to your week. I'm Dina Meyer, Marketing Manager for Corwin, the sponsor of today's webinar. We're thrilled to have all of you join us. I see people from all over the United States, Canada, Ireland, Australia, so many other locations, and we just want to warmly welcome each of you. Before our presenters get started, I wanted to cover a few items. If we can go to the next slide. First, you can view all the upcoming Corwin webinars at corwin.com/webinars. And to give you a taste of what's coming up, on April 5th, Julie Stern will be presenting Learning That Transfers, Designing Curriculum for a Changing World. And on April 19th, you'll have Dominique Smith and Doug Fisher and Nancy Frye on Removing Labels, Disrupting the Negative Effects of Labels and Assumptions. On May 3rd, Shane Saphir and team will present on Street Data, a next generation model for equity, pedagogy, and school transformation. Again, corwin.com/webinars to sign up for any of those webinars and also to view any of our archived webinars. On the next slide, we'll review a couple Zoom keeping reminders. Most of you have your chat boxes opened. Be sure that you're chatting to all panelists and attendees, not just to the panelists. If you want everybody to see it, make sure that drop down says all panelists and attendees. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with your certificate of attendance, will be sent out via email to you in the next couple of days. If for some reason you don't see it in your inbox, add info@k12.corwin.com to your email contacts to be sure that you get that email. And next, to address a growing call to support educators who find themselves teaching in a simultaneous learning environment, today's presenters did author a new book called The Quick Guide to Simultaneous, Hybrid, and Blended Learning. The content from this book provides the basis for today's presentation. And just to let you all know that this book did arrive into our warehouse last Tuesday, so if you pre-ordered the book, it's on its way to you, if not already in your hands. And for a nice surprise to start your week, we're going to be giving away 2 copies of the new book at the end of the webinar. So the winners will be selected at random, but you need to be still attending the webinar and present to win. So next, I have the pleasure of introducing your presenters for today's webinar. Doug Fisher and Nancy Frye are joining us from Southern California. And Doug and Nancy are both professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University, as well as leaders at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Doug has served as a teacher, language development specialist, and administrator in public schools and nonprofit organizations. Nancy has been a special education teacher, a reading specialist, and administrator in public schools. Doug and Nancy have engaged in professional learning communities for several decades, building teams that design and implement systems to impact teaching and learning. They've published numerous books, including the Success Criteria Playbook, the PLC Plus series, and the Distance Learning Playbook series. John Almarode, who joins us from Virginia, is an associate professor and executive director of teaching and learning in the College of Education at James Madison University. He works with pre-service teachers and actively pursues his research interests. He and his colleagues have presented their work to the United States Congress, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. John has authored multiple articles, reports, and books, including the Visible Learning for Mathematics series, Clarity for Learning, and the Success Criteria Playbook. Aleigha Henderson-Rosser is joining us from Georgia. Aleigha is a professor of educational leadership at Mercer University and executive director for instructional technology at Atlanta Public Schools. Her primary role as chief enthusiast and champion of innovative pedagogies in 21st century teaching and learning keeps her close to the work of instructional technology as a practitioner. She has served as a middle school science teacher, instructional technology specialist, coordinator of professional learning, and administrator for one of Georgia's first virtual high schools. So now let's get started. Aleigha, I'll let you kick it off for us.
Thank you so much, Dina. Hi guys, welcome. And thank you for spending your Monday afternoon with us on this awesome webinar. I'm excited to talk about our experience here in Atlanta Public Schools around virtual learning for student success. If you all remember your D-Day date, that was the date that you were told, hey, we're breaking for something called the coronavirus, and we will probably be back in school in about 2 weeks. So I don't know what you were told, but I left my shoes and a coat, I think a sweater and a lunch bag in my office. But my D date was March 13th. I see a lot of people saying March 13th. And we just went back in January. So my lunch bag was still there. Thankfully, I didn't have too many things in there that could go awry. So after we left on March 13th, we really did have to figure out what were our next steps. And although this graphic is awesome, we did not have this worked out for us right after March 13th. Fortunately for us here in Atlanta, we had a snow event or winter weather event that caused us to shut down schools for about a week. You may have seen us on the news. There was no one was moving. There was ice everywhere and schools were closed for almost a week. Because of that weather event, we as a district implemented some distance learning protocols with using Google Classroom. So we enacted those protocols when we broke for COVID. Of course, we didn't have anything long-term. We had a couple of lessons that were built into Google Classroom that we asked our teachers to use, but it did buy us some time to be able to figure out what would be next. And we worked up until May, you know, just like everybody else, we survived pandemic learning. Through May, our teachers were using PDF and worksheets, and, you know, they tried to do the best that they could to get us through that second half of the spring semester. As we moved into fall and we realized, oh my gosh, we're not going back, you know, even this fall, even in August, we weren't going back to school. We realized we had to do something really, really different from what we did in what I call pandemic learning. So we came up with this integrated approach for successful online learning. And I want you to focus on these 3 components that you see in the triangle. First, we had to identify how will we engage our students. We wanted live instruction because there wasn't a lot of live instruction after March 13th. Again, our teachers were in survival mode. So for live instruction, we chose Zoom. I'm sure many of you probably use Google Meets, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, but any kind of video conferencing software. So we wanted our teachers to be able to have a live interaction with the students, and we were going to measure that engagement. So that was one engagement point. Another engagement point was how will they interact with the teacher through assignments? So we employed a learning management system. For us, that was Google Classroom. I'm sure some of you may be using Schoology or other things that are out there. That was our learning management system. We also wanted to make sure that students were engaged in the digital content. And we used Nearpod for that. If you've not seen Nearpod, it is an awesome tool, something that you can go and check out. It's one of those things you can use across all grade levels, and teachers can go in and create their own content from things that are there. Like I said, after March 13th, people were kind of using their worksheet. They were holding up different things to the camera. Our teachers are not content creators, right? They're not digital content creators. They use what they had in their classroom, and we wanted to make sure we gave them additional tools. So that green side that you see were all of our engagement tools. The other piece at the bottom, the blue bar, were our content management systems. Again, our teachers aren't content creators. So we wanted to, this was the one thing that myself and the teaching and learning department, John, that we agreed upon, right? So I'm coming from the educational technology world. Our content people, our curriculum folks are like, look, it's gotta be this way. It's gotta be standards aligned. We were able to go through a couple of different processes to come up with which systems we wanted our teachers to pull content from. So you can see those listed there by elementary, middle, and high school. And we also understood that our young learners in pre-K needed something different. So we also focused on a content management system just for pre-K. The other side of our triangle was our digital content resources. And those are just your virtual field trips, virtual manipulatives like Didax in math. It's a great virtual tool if you've not used Didax before. And ebooks. I mean, we have an expansive ebook library. We were already cultivating that. But if you don't have that, your local library has an ebook shelf. And we were able to get our students to have unlimited checkout of books. And so if you don't have an ebook collection already, check with your local library, and districts can partner with that library for students to continue to check out books. And so this was our integrated approach. We had to figure something else out and really have a plan, you know, for our communities and for our parents. Every town hall that we did, every piece of information that we sent out to the community had this integrated approach there. So everybody could see that we really thought through what successful online teaching and learning can look like. Nancy, if you'll click for me. So moving past, you know, our completely virtual environment, I don't know if you all have gone back yet, but we started back in January and we realized we got to create something else that's really robust for our teachers and students. We're going to now engage in simultaneous learning. And so through that, we had to identify what are the tools for simultaneous learning. One thing we did in our district was create a choice board for schools. There are some schools who thought, you know, we only have this low percentage that are returning to our schools, so I'm going to have a simultaneous learning team. That may have only been about 20 teachers. And then there were others that said every teacher is going to engage in simultaneous learning. And so depending on what you had, we created a choice board that said you can use this type of document camera, you can use a clip-on webinar camera, you can even install cameras in your classroom that span the classroom and follow the teacher. So we had different price points for our schools, but we wanted them to be able to choose from a variety of different tools. Now, these same tools are the ones that we work with our IT department to make sure we're supported. So that's a really critically important piece. Don't go run out and buy something that your IT department does not know how to support, because you want to work in tandem with them and make sure that everything works successfully for your students and teachers. And you'll see that voice amplifier. That may be something a little bit different. We were fortunate in that we were one of the last Metro Atlanta districts to return. So I was able to learn from my colleagues who shared with me all of the different tools that they were using. Instead of just getting a regular kind of microphone that goes, you know, around the ear, we had to keep in mind that teachers have on masks. And that became an issue for our Zoomies who are on Zoom, and we'll talk about that in a second, to be able to hear the teacher. So instead, we got a microphone with a voice amplifier, and we'll have a video in a second that shows you how that works. Nancy, if you could click for me. So what exactly is simultaneous or concurrent learning? One more slide. This picture shows you exactly what it looks like. So your Zoomies are sitting on the screen. As you can see, it's a little blurry, but that's really how it looks like in the classroom. Your Zoomies are on video on your interactive board, and your Roomies are in the room with you. And we can see our teacher is there. She's got a webcam clipped onto her laptop, and she's there at the desk. One thing we have learned in APS is if you want to have your teacher to have a little bit more flexibility and moving around the classroom, you can also use an iPad. Have the teacher sign into Zoom through an iPad so they're not tethered to the desk and they're not just sitting straight in front of the Zoomies. They can also walk around and carry the Zoomies with them. So that's one other way to think about this. I'm sure that you all have lots of ideas about how this is going to work. Typically, if you've got a camera, a microphone, a computer, and a way to project it, this will work for you. There are a number of different combinations. I'll be in the chat to talk about more and support and answer questions for you. But this is ideally what it actually looks like. So I have a colleague of mine who they've recorded a video for us that talks about how all of these different instruments and tools work together. So Nancy, that's our next slide.
Of learners. They now have two different populations of students to ensure that learning is taking place. These populations are known as Zoomies and Roomies. The teacher will need to be intentional about meshing these two groups together into one dynamic learning community. The group of students known as Zoomies will be joining the teacher's classroom through video conference software. Today's demonstration shows that we are using Zoom. The other group of students, known as Roomies, are students who are sitting in front of the teacher in the physical classroom. The following tools will demonstrate how a teacher can use various technology to ensure equitable learning across her classroom community.
Even though during simultaneous learning, we now have two groups of students, Roomies and Zoomies, some things don't change. Good pedagogy is still good pedagogy. We're still going to meet our students where they are. We're still going to differentiate by product, process, and content. And we're working really hard on building rapport and building community in this setting. Let's take a look. One of the benefits of simultaneous learning is that both groups of students now have access to a live teacher inside of her own resource-rich classroom. Let's look at a few tools to help us execute simultaneous learning. You'll notice I'm wearing the headset. This is a wireless voice amplifier. In a classroom, a teacher will normally have on a mask to protect both herself and the students. This allows her voice to become larger and clearer to both sets of students. It is wireless, so it does not need to hook up to her computer, allowing her to walk around the classroom freely as needed. It also has its own wireless speaker. Okay? I can attach this to my belt so that my voice is louder as I walk, or I can take it and place it somewhere in the classroom so that my students can hear me. Again, a wireless voice amplifier. A few of these tools are very familiar to us, including our interactive whiteboard. We use it, of course, to make our interactive lessons come alive. We're now going to use it so that we can project our Zoomies right into the room as needed. We also see a document camera, which of course will allow us to project our materials and resources, including books, maps, and all manner of items up for instruction. Also, when lifted, this gives us a view of the room and can show the Roomies to the Zoomies if it's called for in a lesson. Our document camera comes with software, but many of them are plug and play. Notice that the setup is very simple. I simply plug my teacher laptop into the board and plug my document camera into my laptop. I can also use my document camera as a camera inside of Zoom.
Here, we see our teacher checking in with our Roomies and our Zoomies to make sure that everyone is logged in and ready for the lesson.
All right, guys, it's just about time for us to break into groups, okay? Let me share my screen.
Are we in the same
so that
group?
Yes, Jade, we are going to be in the same group. Is that Brooke? Okay, Brooke. Yes, Brooke. We're going to be in the same groups as last time. Thanks for asking. Appreciate you. Okay. All right. So we're going to have our independent groups, and then one group will work with me, and then we'll flip flop, and I will rotate, and I'll get to all of the groups today. Okay. All right. So we are going to go to News ELA. We're going to read the article about classic toys making a comeback during the pandemic. I
know a lot about this. My family has a lot of games at home.
Oh, okay. All right. So then you should know quite a bit about this topic. Then I can't wait to hear your critique. whether you support their points or whether you have something to critique about it. Thanks.
Using the strategy of working in groups is a great time to help build community. There are opportunities for peer-to-peer collaboration, peer tutoring, as well as one-on-one time with the teacher, which could include formal or informal assessments. These digital breakout rooms allow for our remote students and our face-to-face students, our Roomies and Zoomies, to meaningfully interact.
Great, thank you. And I see a couple of different points in the chat. Something I do want to point out that we learned very quickly, and work with your IT department, your infrastructure team on bandwidth. If you're gonna have cameras on in the classroom with your Roomies, and of course the Zoomies also have their cameras on, that is going to eat up the bandwidth in your district. So you're going to have to, if you're going to have both of those running at the same time, where the Zoomies are on camera as well as the Roomies, and you do want that interaction between Zoomies and Roomies to help build community, bandwidth is a very key issue that you're going to have to tackle prior to doing this. Have your IT department test bandwidth in your schools, run as many tests as you can to make sure that this format works in your school district. So a lot of things are you can consider. I see people are getting very inventive. They're using their Android phone. They're using different cameras and different screens. In education, we are very resourceful, so we can figure this out. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is that this is not an easy task for teachers. It takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of practice. In training, give your teachers time to practice this. Have them practice with each other, and give them some space and grace to be able to do this work. It's a new way of learning for us. We do know moving forward that COVID has not quite gone away. So there will be times that we'll jump in and out of this format, I'm sure throughout the next few years. So make sure that teachers have the time, the space, and the grace to make sure that they can get this accomplished for our students and for effective learning virtually and in the classroom. So I'm going to turn this part over now to Doug, who's going to give you some pointers about reflective questions for teaching Zoomies and Roomies.
Thank you. So there's things we need to be thinking about. Now, what's really important, when you heard Aleigha talking, we never said that they are simultaneous the entire class period or simultaneous the entire 3-hour literacy block. When you plan your lessons, what would be most efficient for simultaneous learning? What would be good for asynchronous learning? And then I'm seeing all the chat and all the rules of all the districts that are making them up. But over time, what we're gonna find is that it is more efficient, it is better for kids if we have regular doses of concurrent or simultaneous instruction. Why would the teacher need to do a whole class lesson 2 times in a day, once for the kids at home, once for the kids physically present? You will save time and you will have more instructional minutes. So it is common to say, for example, we're gonna do, yes, Nancy, let's not double the work. We're gonna have a 30-minute, whole class lesson. Then Zoomies, you're gonna go do this. Roomies, you're gonna do this. We're gonna check back in 20 minutes. We're gonna have a next part of our lesson. We're gonna go, that's very common, that give and take. We are even seeing some districts where there's amazing small group instruction, 2 physically present kids at a table with the teacher, distance, and 2 laptops with 2 remote learners. So, and a small group instruction. We are seeing such cool things happen. Let's not double the work. Now, rapidly, I want to show you a bunch of models. The 3 most common models we're seeing in the US right now, as people have gone to simultaneous. There are 3 very consistent models we're seeing. The first is the AB. This is a very common model. Usually there's an asynchronous day, and then half the students come 2 days and the other half come 2 days. Some people do 2 consecutive days, some people split the days. So there's a group of students who are face-to-face learning, and the opposite group is synchronous and asynchronous. So there are some simultaneous times and some not simultaneous times. We did not say the whole day is going to be simultaneous kids on computers watching their class, but there are times where it really works best to do that. Now, technically, there's probably a group C, which is our full remote learners who never come to class. And so but we want to make sure when we have the group C, they're not just doing asynchronous learning all day, every day. So there's a planning tool that we have in the playbook that says, how are you going to organize group A? How are you going to organize group B each of the days? What do you need for these students to do each day? So we're not planning 2 separate lessons. We're planning, here's the lessons, here's how it's going to work for the Roomies or the Zoomies or the meets and the seats and all the different things we're coming up with now. Another model that we see is the split day. So this one has all learners in synchronous distance learning in the morning, and then some of the students come in the afternoon and the other half do asynchronous learning. This is a very common model in elementary. You'll see this a lot. One of our local districts does this as well. And what you'll find when teachers do this is, they'll talk to the physically present kids and they'll reference the computer. Then they'll talk to the computer and reference the physical kids. It's becoming really natural for people. And there's a planning tool for that one. And then probably the common one for high schools, not everywhere, but some on high schools will be a week on and a week off. So the face-to-face kids come for a week and then they're home for a week. The theory behind this is if group A for the week had some sort of outbreak or whatever, group B would not be infected with the A-B schedule. So this is more common in secondary schools. And of course, then we need planning tools for that as well. Now, what we notice is no matter what, we have to make sure that the clarity of the lessons is present. Because if students don't know what they're supposed to be learning, they might misbehave a little bit, they might go off topic. So we've argued teacher clarity has been important for years. In simultaneous concurrent learning, it is critical that students know what it is they're supposed to be learning, because they are and the teacher's trying to manage multiple groups. Teacher clarity is more than learning intentions and success criteria, although those are important. When you look at the clarity research, is the lesson organized? Which is why we just showed you those 3 models. Is there an organization? Do the Roomies and the Zoomies know and experience an organized flow of lessons? Is there clarity in the explanations we provide? And I saw in the chat that there's a whole bunch of ways that we can record content. We can record some direct instruction. We can record a think aloud. We can still do all of that. And if we, so one of the things we learned as the districts, Fulton and Atlanta and Pocatello and have done this, it's not like the technology goes away when kids show up back at school, because they're apart and there's all this other stuff happening. So the technology is still there. So we can have them watching videos in school as well. Clarity of the examples and clarity of the assessment. Here's one of the things we learned. When we organize the instruction, well, we know this. We organize instruction, students learn more. If you are going to be teaching Roomies and Zoomies or whatever you call them, please don't try to start both groups at the same moment in time. Some teachers prefer to start their Roomies first, get them all settled, and then invite the Zoomies in. Other teachers prefer to have the Zoomies start, talk to the kids remote, make sure they're connected, and then bring the physical present kids in. Give yourself a window between the start of the 2 groups. It'll reduce the anxiety and the stress. So please feel free to do that. So you organize your instruction, you say, okay, which group do I want first? What am I doing with them? Then I'm going to bring the second group in for learning. Another effect of that, explaining content. When we're really good at explaining content, so demonstrating, those things, students learn more. None of these should be a surprise to you. When we provide examples and guided practice, students learn more. That shouldn't be a surprise to you. And when we assess learners and we understand where they are in the learning journey, they actually learn more. None of that's a surprise. Keep the learning front and center. So we created these 3 questions years ago. What am I learning today? Why am I learning this? How will I know that I learned it? So if you keep this as your center, if you keep this and saying, Roomies and Zoomies, what are we learning today? Why are we learning this? How will we know we learned it? So we're going to visit a teacher in Dallas, first grade teacher in Dallas. Take a look at her opening of her lesson with her Roomies and Zoomies.
We need to know our big goal. If we're playing basketball and we have no idea where the hoop is, are we going to be able to score a goal? No, we've got to figure out where that goal is, and we have to know what our goal is and how we get there. Our learning goal today is I am learning how to solve addition problems using strategies. That is our big goal. Our success criteria, how we're going to get there. I can use objects or pictures to show the problem. I can find the sum of a group of 10 and another number. Ready to rock? Near. I am learning how to solve addition problems using strategies. I can use objects and pictures to show the problem. I can find the sum of a group of 10 and another number. Ready to rock? Once we know what our goal is, then we are ready
How
to work
awesome
toward that goal.
is that? So in this case, the Zoomies are on the little laptop you see because she's projecting the learning intention success criteria. And then she flips it so the Roomies and the Zoomies, they're seeing each other. She has a camera in the back of her room, as Aleigha was talking about. There's many options so that for the Zoomies to watch what's happening in the class. Kids are learning. It's easier. I talked to this teacher. It is easier to do this simultaneous so they all know what they're learning. She will then go into the lesson. She will send the Zoomies to do something and the Roomies to do something. She brings them back together. It's working. And she will say, and I think Aleigha would agree with this, when you get up to speed on simultaneous learning, it is easier than the other models. It is less work than trying to plan 2 or 3 different flow of lessons for different groups of kids. She's got a second laptop where she's projecting. That's so that little one is where they're watching her. Aleigha, do you remember the name of the camera that you put in the back of the room that follows the teacher on the wall?
I feel like it's a Logitech camera.
Logitech, I think that's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then we started saying, well, let's make this transparent to students. What if we ask students as part of their asynchronous learning to tell us, what were you learning today? Why are you learning this? How will you know you learned it? And I think this is a really cool asynchronous homework task that's way better than some of the things we used to be giving students to do.
Today I learned how to analyze a nonfiction text using cultural criticism. We used the text segregated from history, how ghetto lost its meaning. The text explains how the word ghetto culturally harms people. The text explains how the word ghetto from many cultures, it means derogatory. It's used as a derogatory term, and it also explains how it confines people to a stereotype. I learned this because we are using our knowledge of cultural criticism that we have previously learned in this class to identify and understand how cultures are represented through film, text, and media. I also learned this because it is important to see the cultural context behind words, phrases, etc. I know that I learned this because I am able to apply this to a real world event and my own work using previous knowledge from other lessons.
That feedback to the teacher. Feedback to the teacher. Did my students know what they were supposed to be learning, and do they know what success looks like?
And engagement, of course, remains that number one question. Certainly through distance learning and the various versions of distance learning, hybrid learning, simultaneous, concurrent, that always is something that comes up for conversation again and again. And we've been really intrigued with the work of Amy Berry in really redefining what it is that engagement actually looks like. I think a lot of times as teachers, we think of engagement in terms of outward behaviors. But what Berry did is really dig down more deeply and look at, with talking with teachers, talking with students, and looking at the evidence of student learning, what that actually looked like. And she noted that there are varying levels of passivity to activity, both on engagement as well as disengagement, that students can be passively disengaged by just separating themselves from the group or being distracted, all the way down to being actively disengaged, especially disrupting the learning environment. But she also noted too that there are varying levels of engagement, and that very often as teachers, we kind of think about that fourth box over, participating, and we call that engagement. But in truth, what she notes is that's relatively passive. We're looking at students doing work or paying attention or responding to questions. And she challenges all of us to really think about engagement as being something much more active, minds on, not just hands on, being able to set goals, seeking feedback, and engaging in that self-assessment. And by the way, if we want students to be more actively engaged, it's up to us as teachers to create those opportunities for students to ask questions, for students to set goals, for students to be able to seek feedback, and so on. And what Berry found was that with each movement to the right, student learning increases along the way. Now, here we are, many of us either just newly engaged or soon to be engaged in simultaneous learning. Let's capitalize on what it is that we have learned over the last year in distance learning. And let's start with reestablishing your norms. If you're moving to a new schedule, take that time to reestablish your norms. Make sure that students know how it is that we work together, Roomies and Zoomies, and how it is that students will be reintroduced to one another, even though they may have been together virtually as a class for the majority of the year. Make sure that they know who are the Roomies and who are the Zoomies at each time. Setting up those norms and those classroom agreements that were so important in your full-time distance learning class remain equally important in simultaneous learning. Keep in mind that students are new to this arrangement. It's time to reestablish what those norms and classroom agreements are going to be as you move into simultaneous learning. Make sure that you're identifying what your expectations are for them. We want students to be engaged, but we also need to be clear about what those expectations are. Make sure that we're not only defining what they are, but spending time in being able to teach them what those expectations are and how it is that they look and sound. We want to make sure that we are really building them for as much success as possible. Another of those learnings that we all learned in full-time distance learning was how important it is to be able to have those frequent interactions. And all of those tools that you've learned how to do, and Aleigha talked about at the beginning of our webinar today, remain just as viable and interesting and useful in a simultaneous environment. In fact, keep in mind that many of those tools were initially designed for full-time face-to-face learning. So using those polls, using those various tools that your students have learned how to use, you continue to use them in simultaneous teaching. You want to make sure that you're making the most of those breakout rooms whenever you do have them. We're still using breakout rooms. The virtual platform remains just as important as always. And one way to be able to consider how it is that you are investing in the classroom community is at times to pair up the Roomies with the Zoomies. In other words, that there are activities that students are doing where those that are at home and those that are in face-to-face are working together in that virtual environment. A reminder for that is that having headphones available for the students in the room is going to make that much more possible for them to be able to engage in those breakout rooms. And one of you had noted early on in the chat about how important it is to make sure that we are teaching in ways that are equitable. What we want to do in particular are do things like teach what those roles are so that the Roomies and Zoomies know how they can work together effectively, and especially to make sure that they have equal access to those resources so that the Zoomies are not disadvantaged. As one of you noted, it's kind of easy to be caught up a bit with what's going on directly in the room and to kind of forget about the Zoomies along the way. So utilizing some of those tools, again, that you have gained digital competence with in your full-time distance learning, super important, whether you're using tools like Wakelet, for example, which as much as anything is kind of like Pinterest for education, where you've got those digital resources that are available for your students to be able to utilize, whether they are Roomies or Zoomies. That way you're not privileging the face-to-face students with access to resources and forgetting about those Zoomies. As well, continue to use those collaborative slides, those Google Docs, so that you can monitor the work that's going on in those small groups. I have to tell you that when we are able to return to full-time face-to-face learning, I will never stop using things like collaborative slides, because it's a way that I can monitor what's happening in all of those groups and not just be dependent on where it is that I happen to be standing in the room at a particular time. Make sure that your students know how to use some of the more advanced features like the Explore feature on Google Docs, which will take them to some curated websites that will contribute to their knowledge of the work that they're doing. Those polls, as I said, are really useful. Use those polls to your advantage in seeking feedback, finding out from students about how this particular task is going for them. Do you think that you have it? Or are you ready for me to move on? Or do you need for me to slow down? We have to check in with students on a regular basis and promote those opportunities for students to be able to self-assess. You know, we're all kind of new at this. Find out from your students about those tasks that you have in simultaneous learning and get feedback from them about what was easy, what was interesting or challenging, or what might be too hard as well, so that we can calibrate. Also, make sure that students have opportunities to monitor their own progress. We use those learning intentions and success criteria and load those right into their digital notebooks so that they can monitor their own progress as well. And of course, we've spent a year in developing their tech tools. We want to keep those sharp for them to be able to use. So remember that you're continuing to use those tools that you have really come to enjoy and utilize, whether you're using things like Padlet, for example, where students can post as Roomies and Zoomies what their ideas are. Again, you've got all this digital competence that's built up. Let's make sure to keep that going. You're still using that in simultaneous learning, asking them questions about what it is that they know for sure about a topic, as well as things that they are speculating on, or things that they are really not certain about. Again, we're talking about higher levels of engagement, getting them to set goals, getting them to self-assess, getting them to be able to ask questions. And with that, I'm going to turn this to John, who's going to talk about the asynchronous learning side of the house.
Absolutely. So the question then becomes, if I have Zoomies and Roomies, if you refer back to those models, you'll notice that each one of those models had some aspect of asynchronous learning. In other words, when they are not with us live and they are working independently, or at least working outside of instantaneous interaction with us. And so there's a continuum that goes with this. There's a continuum associated with that learning. So for example, the continuum from asynchronous to synchronous time focuses on opportunities for students to preview and review. Now, those are two big words that we're going to focus on in just a second. How we use our synchronous time, well, that's what we've been talking about prior to this particular part of the webinar. We've talked about engagement. We've talked about the wiring and the sound and the actions and the different tools for synchronous learning, the Kahoots, the Jamboards, they're there. Now let's talk about asynchronous time. How do we capitalize on this? We have to rethink how we use our time in asynchronous learning so that we can capitalize on what happens in the classroom or when they're logged onto Zoom synchronously, because this is going to cut down on instructional time. There's no way to slice it. There's no way to package that with any better news unless we capitalize on what we know about how students learn and use that in asynchronous learning. And that's the preview and the review part. How do we get students to engage in high quality learning experiences that are still aligned with success criteria, but also provide the scaffolding and the support so that learners are not teaching themselves complex material, which ups the possibility of misconceptions, misunderstandings, and the need to reteach or correct. So let's talk about preview and review as bookends. How do we bookend the asynchronous learning? Here's what I mean by that. Asynchronous learning prior to the introduction of content, we can use asynchronous learning to preview upcoming material. This is where we get the opportunity to do things like build background knowledge, build vocabulary, front load learning. And then at the end, how do we help them engage in review, or what we're going to learn in just a second is deliberate practice. So let's start with previewing or building that knowledge asynchronously. There's incredible amounts of research about the role of prior knowledge in later on academic success. There's also a lot of research that says we can front load vocabulary. We can provide early exposure and experiences to content, skills, and understandings so that when they are with us, whether Zoomies or Roomies, Meaties or Seedies, that one I loved. I had not heard that one before. I have giggled about that the entire webinar. So Zoomies and Roomies that we can teach. In fact, are you ready for this? If you're going to write something down, this might be it. You almost triple the rate of learning when students engage in strategies that integrate prior knowledge with new learning. Almost triple the rate of learning. So why not use our asynchronous time to preview? Maybe we provide a video where they watch the video and provide fill-in notes, or have them engage in some type of concept mapping or some type of drawing. For example, the water cycle. How do we get them to have exposure to that vocabulary that they're going to need later? This is very important for learners who are developing proficiency in English. If we can get the vocab on the front end, it makes learning in the classroom much easier, because now we've addressed the barrier that is vocab, because there is not a barrier in terms of intellectual capacity. The same thing goes with mathematics. If we can give them a context in which we're going to work on polynomials or rational expressions, then when we come in and work through that process, they have something to hook it onto. That's the whole point of this next idea. Where does learning come from? Learning is a nice combination of memory and attention. Learning happens in a more effective and efficient way when we have something to root it in from a prior experience. But don't panic. Kindergarten teachers, individuals that teach material that no one has any experience with technically, we might have to work a little harder for this, but we can indeed root it in something that they're used to. Using our asynchronous time to build that capacity is a powerful use of that time. So that's the front end, preview. Give them an exposure, give them an experience, give them interactions with the content prior to showing up. Then we have our synchronous experience. And now how do we tie this in? How do we close that loop, so to say? Well, there is something that we can pull. It's called retrieval practice. And by the way, how we do this, gosh, this is awesome. This is not new. This is over 150 years of research from the cognitive scientists that say, look, if you don't repeat something in a deliberate way, odds of you remembering it go way down. So what does that mean? Does it mean we regurgitate? Does it mean we answer true and false questions? No, it's actually a special type of retrieval. In fact, it requires learners to actively recall information, actively pull it together. Richard Mayer calls it generative learning, in which the learners are actually asked to generate something. Let me give you a couple of examples. Maybe after a class on ancient Greece or ancient Rome, learners are asked to develop a summary in their own words. Maybe they're asked to create a graphic organizer, a knowledge map, or a concept map that pulls together big ideas and shows relationships. Maybe they're asked to draw a picture or develop an image. Maybe they're asked to develop their own quiz or test so that they can test themselves. What do each of those strategies have in common? Well, first and foremost, they move learning forward. They're well documented in the research for doing that. But the main characteristic, the one I want to zero in on right here, is that they're generative. They're not passive tasks, they're active tasks where learners have to pull together information in a way and make meaning of that information so that it sticks. Here's an example of a research study that shows the clear difference in those that engaged in retrieval practice versus those that did not. Take a look. Check that out. Even at the end of the semester, the gain in learning stayed. It held, and that's really important. We all know that retrieval practice is sometimes confused with cramming. I want to point something out. You see this study right here? This study would be very different if it was cramming. Cramming means you might do well at the end of the chapter, but you're not going to do well at the end of the semester. If you don't believe me, think back to your college days. You crammed, you passed the test. What did you end up having to do before the final exam? Cram again. Cramming doesn't work, but retrieval practice, spacing it out over time, does work. Here's one very specific example of a strategy. It carries an effect size of 0.54. Now, someone asked earlier what the D represents. That's called Cohen's D. I'm going to geek it up for a minute. Cohen's D is a way to show growth, and the units are standard deviations. And so 0.54 is well above what we expect from 1 year's worth of growth. In this next video, you're going to see an example of a technology tool that is an excellent way to embed retrieval practice. Remember, on the backside bookend, how do we get learners to review and engage in retrieval practice around the life cycle of a butterfly asynchronously? Take a look at this next clip for just a brief example of what this might look like.
John, I apologize. I have a different video in there.
Oh,
not the live. I have the water cycle one.
Oh, even better. That's
I'm sorry.
That's a great video. No, perfect. Let's watch the water cycle.
Your team's so ready for the big game tomorrow? Yeah, we're ready. But look at the field. There are puddles everywhere. Come on, don't let a little precipitation get you down. What? Precipitation. It's another word for rain. Actually, for any form of water that falls from the sky. You mean like snow, sleet, or hail? Yup, they're precipitation too. Well, if this precipitation doesn't stop soon, we'll be playing slip and slide instead of soccer tomorrow. Don't worry, RJ. Tomorrow's supposed to be hot and sunny. Those puddles will be history by game time. How can you be sure? Let's just say I'm counting on the water cycle to do its stuff. What comes down must go up. The water cycle is the endless path that water takes from the earth to the clouds and then back to the earth again. We already talked about precipitation, like this rain. Right. Well, when precipitation falls from the sky, it fills the lakes, rivers, and oceans, runs down the mountain, and soaks into the soil. And we drink it. We do. So do other animals and plants, too. They draw in water to get nutrients from the soil and to keep cool. We're all part of the water cycle, but not the only part. Did you know that a lot of water just disappears into thin air? Really? How? Through evaporation. When water gets warmed by the sun, it changes from a liquid into an invisible gas called water vapor. Invisible? What? The water's still in the air, but you can't see it because it's a gas. I'd call that evaporation. So if water vapor is invisible, how do we know it's there? Sometimes you can feel it. You know, like on those hot, humid days. Oh, yeah. When just kicking the ball around makes you sweat. Exactly. Sweat evaporates too. That's another way water gets back into the air. And plants do kind of the same thing. Plants sweat? Kind of. It's called transpiration.
And I'm going to do a little pause on that, because what happens in an interactive video is that you take a video such as that comes from Edpuzzle, and you load right in there what your questions are so that the video pauses and students have to engage in that retrieval of information to pull that right out of their brain and answer that question. That video won't go forward until that question is answered. And you get great data from students about how many attempts they needed to make in order to do so.
And the beauty of that is, many of you in the chat box, when you were watching it, you got that uncomfortable feeling in your stomach. When you got that feeling, that would have been a moment to insert a question. You could have used this for preview. You could have used this for preview and then followed it up with retrieval practice at the end to respond to that quick question. But this is where you would stop it, ask a question about precipitation, ask a question about transpiration, ask a question about evaporation. The point is to make interactive videos. How do we take something like this and make it work? Well, here are a few tips to keep in mind that if you pull a video from the web, from the internet, if you pull a video from your own library, what can you do? Well, limit it to about 6 minutes. Why? That's about all of our attention spans can handle. The next thing you want to do is figure out, what is the purpose? Is the purpose of this video to learn the vocabulary, or is the purpose of this video to summarize or reconstruct the water cycle? That's going to determine the type of questions you ask. The questions need to align with those learning intentions. Make sure that everything is ready to go. You need to tell the students at the beginning, you're going to need to take your own notes or download my notes that you're going to fill in, or whatever other supplies you're going to need. Then build in those questions. But again, make sure those questions are focusing on what you want. Is it vocab? Is it summarizing? Is it looking for applications? And then finally, make sure you mix up the questions. Multiple choice, of course, you know they can get right by chance. Open-ended questions help you see the vocab that they're after. The whole idea behind preview and review, in particular, preview gives that pre-exposure that almost triples the rate of learning. The review asks them to apply their knowledge. And this application is absolutely essential in asynchronous learning so that when they come back to us in synchronous, they've got their questions ready or they're ready to move forward in their learning. A couple of more pointers just to think about. Here's some considerations for getting students to engage in practice. Have they been taught about the value of practice? This is something that I think will come back with us when we get back into the classroom, is how important practice is. Do we have a way to make sure they get their feedback? If we're using IXL or Reflex, it takes care of it for us as long as the practice is targeting gaps in their learning and we're not just assigning them something to do. Do students know about the role of practice and they view it as something other than compliance, but actually as a way to amplify and move their learning forward? Deliberate practice has an effect size of approximately 0.65. Between 0.65 and 0.69, it does fluctuate, but it does depend on students. Do we move them beyond their comfort zone, filling the gaps between where they are and where we want them to be and where they want to be? Is the deliberate practice specific? They're not practicing everything. They're practicing very specific needs, regrouping, place value, inferences. And do they have time to focus on this? And are we setting it up so that they can focus on this without other distractions? And can we help them find places in their own homes or with their families to do so? Do we provide feedback? And then how do we help them develop a mental model of expertise? In other words, what does success look like? It takes us back to that clarity piece. In sum, here's how it works. Asynchronous learning can move, accelerate, amplify, and propel learning forward if we use it as preview and review, not just mindless homework and mindless repetition, but instead focusing on what the learners need and closing that gap from where they are to where we want them to be. That's the focus of asynchronous learning.